thank you all. مساء الخير. مرحبا في هذا الحدث هذا اليوم. هذه فرصة ممتازة وشرف كبير أن يكون معنا الأستاذ الدكتور Khaled Abou El Fadl. I'll switch to English. It's good to hear some Arabic for our classes. So I want to start. My name is. Oh, sorry. My name is Rashid Adnani, and I'm the Director of Middle Eastern Studies at Wellesley. I want to start just with a quick note of thanks for all the people and organizations that have made this event possible. First of all, my dear colleagues, Dan Zitnik, Edwin Cartains, and Luis Marlo. I also want to thank Amir Qureshi, the Muslim chaplain at Wellesley College, the Wellesley Arab women for their continued support. And I also want to thank our wonderful administrative assistant, Wendy Forrester, for all the time and effort she put into making this event happen. I also want to thank the Department of Religion for the generous support for the event. Also, Grace Song for all the logistics and making possible that this lecture became possible. Finally, I would like to make some special thanks to Susie Choquette and her generous support for the program for Middle Eastern Studies. This event and all our other events are part of the J.R. Choquette Cultural Event Series that are dedicated to the memory of Susie's late husband, J.R. Choquette. Just a quick note, one of the other events coming up in this series is a film screening. It's a film about a Palestinian judge, and the film is called Al-Qadiyah, The Judge, and it will be screened on the 24th of October at Colonial Cinema at 6:30 p.m. Where do I start introducing Dr. Abou El Fadl? On a personal note, his writings and his scholarship were really helpful to me in figuring out all sorts of questions I was having myself as a student from Morocco in graduate school in the United States in the post-9/11 era. So I'm very grateful for that, and I'm very grateful for the scholarship that he put forward since that time, and that he continues to put forward. Dr. Abou El Fadl holds a BA in Political Science from Yale University, a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and an MA and a PhD in Islamic law from Princeton University. Dr. Abou El Fadl is also an Islamic jurist and scholar, having received 13 years of systematic instruction in Islamic jurisprudence, grammar, and eloquence in Egypt and Kuwait. After law school, he clerked for Arizona Supreme Court Justice James Mueller and practiced immigration and investment law in the US and in the Middle East. He previously taught Islamic law at the University of Texas, at Austin Law School, Yale Law School, and Princeton University. His latest book is entitled Reasoning with God, Reclaiming Sharia in the Modern Age. And the talk is based on that same title. This book was published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2017. And it is considered to be his magnum opus and intellectual autobiography. Among his other books, there is The Great Theft, Wrestling Islam from the Extremists, HarperCollins 2001, Speaking in God's Name, Islamic Law, Authority and Women, One World Publications 2001. In addition to this already impressive list of publications, it is worth mentioning his other titles, such as Rebellion and Violence in Islamic Law, and God Knows the Soldiers, The Authoritative and Authoritarian in Islamic Discourses, Islam and the Challenge of Democracy, The Place of Tolerance in The Place of Tolerance in Islam, and The Search for Beauty in Islam, a conference of the books. His book, The Great Theft, was named one of the top 100 books of the year by Canada's Globe and Mail, Canada's leading newspaper. and his book, The Search for Beauty in Islam, a conference of the books, is viewed by many as a landmark work in modern Muslim literature. We're honored to have Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl with us tonight, and I invite you to join me in welcoming him to Wellesley College. The talk will be about 40 minutes to leave us time for Q&A session, and followed by a small reception with some delicious food, Middle Eastern food. Thank you very much. And for you, if you are interested in asking more questions, there is going to be a Q&A session, information session tomorrow at 12:30 at the Multi-Faith Center at the chapel, co-hosted by Amir Al-Quraishi, who's with us here today. If you have more questions about the event, please ask her after the talk. Thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Abou El Fadl.
You're mostly women. Yeah, I have to remind myself, this is an all-women's college. Very unusual where I come from, where men tend to dominate over everything. I thank the organizers who were quite steadfast about getting me here. And show of hands, how many of you have heard of the violinist Hilary Hahn?
Repeat again.
The violinist Hilary Hahn? Okay. Well, just so you know how valuable I sacrificed a concert by the violinist Hilary Hahn to be here. In my book, that's huge. Classical music is the stuff of life, and in Reasoning with God, one of the analogies that has largely gone unnoticed, I have to say, except for one reviewer, Nader Hashmi. I compare Sharia law to classical music, and I understand Sharia as a classical music performance, which I hope I'll get into in a second. If you haven't fallen in love with classical music, you're missing out. Your life is just a waste. So, might as well, catch up and make it meaningful. Okay, well, years ago, I think it was 2003 or around that time, I was giving a named lecture at San Diego, I believe it was called the Bear Collection. And like this lecture, I was asked to talk about Sharia. At the time, 2003, we were still at the very beginning stages of the rise of Islamophobia. And I was extremely concerned about the rise of this particular type of committed bigotry and thinly veiled racism. And in the Burke lecture, I started my talk with focusing on Islamophobia and what I saw as an extremely dangerous trajectory. From my point of view, and it's the point of view that I elaborated upon in various writings, including Reasoning with God, Islamophobia posed and continues to pose many dangers, including a danger on the integrity of our discourses on Sharia Islamophobia represents a form of racism that targets the low-hanging fruit. That although the immediate objects are Muslims, the implications of that type of discourse, with all its presumptive racism and bigotry, was extremely alarming. Well, at the Burke lecture, I started with the focus on Islamophobia and warned my audience that we will reach a day and age in which no one is interested in learning discourses on Sharia, because Islamophobia, by the mechanics of its structure and the type of assumptions that it makes about the other, where the other becomes the embodiment of everything that we find to be alien and undesirable, that type of discourse is going to have widespread implications, not just in the West, but even in the Muslim world. I got the impression that people hated my Burke lecture. The organizers didn't like it. And everyone basically had the point of, we invited you to talk about Sharia, so why do you talk about Islamophobia? For many reasons, the two cannot be separated. And so I'm not because I love people being disappointed in me, but I repeat the performance today. I start with Islamophobia as the embarking point. The history between Islam and the West, as we probably all know, is quite complex and nuanced. And it has witnessed points of discourse, influences, a complex dynamics of defining the self and defining the other. But Islamophobia has regardless of the complexity of that history, Islamophobia continues an orientation and a trend that is particularly dangerous in our modern world and particularly lethal. To put it bluntly, through a complex process of evolution, Muslims reach the point where they search for articulations in which to negotiate between the historical legacy of Islam and the epistemological demands of modernity. And part and parcel of this paradigm where Muslims negotiate between the legacy of history and the epistemological demands of modernity is the necessity of a sense of self-confidence and absence of dread when engaging in a discourse about your own tradition. Islamophobia, though, creates the other as it attempts to describe the other. It is an active reconstruction of the Muslim in an age where in post-colonialism, imperialism and its various colonial-inspired constructs are so powerful that in many ways they form the discourse in the Muslim world. So for instance, when in the West, Arnold Toynbee used to speak about those who attempted to co-opt the Islamic tradition into what in Arnold Toynbee's days, he was a British historian, at the beginning of the 20th century, what he described as the zealots. We find in Islamic literature throughout Muslims importing the concept of the zealot as the native voice that attempts to rethink the Islamic tradition in opposition or separate apart from the sociological demands of various nationalist creeds. When in the West, the discourse became rephrased in terms of fundamentalism versus non-fundamentalism, the Muslim world adopted the same language. And all Muslims were talking about the fundamentalists versus the non-fundamentalists. In the West, the term was recast in terms of militant Islam versus non-militant Islam. All over the Muslim world, intellectuals started speaking in terms of the native militant versus the non-native militant. Today, when in the West, a phrase that deserves careful interrogation and analysis, such as political Islam, was articulated first and enunciated first in the West, we find that same expression adopted throughout the Muslim world. Everyone, including various Muslim governments and their various functionaries, talking about political Islam versus non-political Islam. Not at the time when we used to talk about zealots versus non-zealots, or fundamentalists versus non-fundamentalists, militants versus non-militants, or political Islam versus political Islam, did we ever really understand what any of these phrases meant, or what they are supposed to describe. At most, they tended to serve as legitimating conservative phraseology that celebrated some form of despotism or another, and fundamentally denied Muslims the basic right to self-determination. Here's the thing about Sharia discourses. In my view, when we talk about Sharia, when a Muslim talks about Sharia, we are engaging in the most basic form of historical self-determination. Sharia is not a sum total of positive legal commands. No legal system in the world is represented by a set of positive legal demands. Imagine, for instance, if I would try to describe American law, and instead of talking about the constitutional structure, judicial structure, the various schools of American jurisprudence, I simply talked about what the tax code says, or what the Immigration and Naturalization Act says, or what any of the many other positive legal commands produced by the vast experience of the American legal system says. Maybe closer to home, imagine if I wanted to talk about Jewish law, and I attempted to summarize or to encapsulate Jewish law in the positive legal commands enunciated in some code, whether by Joseph Caro in the 16th century or earlier by Maimonides, or any of the positive legal commands. Immediately, a jurist would respond and say, a legal system is not its sum total, or in part even, its positive legal commands. What does represent a legal system? Well, at a minimum, a legal system is a methodology. It is a way of approaching things, a way of asking questions and phrasing issues. All those that work within a legal system will tell you that the question you pose within a legal culture is far more important than the answer that you give. It is the phrasing of the question that helps us understand the nature of a legal system, not the particular responses that have been given within the course of historically contingent circumstance. Sharia, in its basic and most rudimentary theoretical construct, is a path to God and from God. But it is not necessarily a path that reduces itself to a particular set of legalistic determinations. The determinations are the byproduct of a legal system. They are not the legal system. What Sharia in its essence is an aspiration. It's a goal. In many ways, it's a dream of some form of self-determination or another. Inspired by history, anchored in a linguistic practice, and ultimately a deliberative and analytical rational process. The essence of what Sharia is reasoning through examples. And the examples are critical to the process of producing a Sharia-informed mind, as well as the historical legacy of what we point to as Sharia. The first things that a student of Sharia would encounter is the enormous amount of diversity and pluralism that all falls within the broad umbrella of the Sharia system. In its core, to say a path to God and from God is very broad. There is within that tradition schools that imagine that the divine will can be accessible and can be realizable by the human agent, and imagined not as an objective presumption about the nature of the truth, but as a legal presumption that is informed by structural and institutional considerations. A jurist is allowed to presume to possess the truth. These schools, or these approaches to Sharia, in the Islamic tradition were represented by people from the Hanbali school of thought, people from the Khariji school of thought, people from the Ibadi school of thought, and others from the Zahiri school of thought. But that, within the Sharia tradition, was always the minority perspective. The majority perspective within the Sharia tradition, the Malikis, the Shafi'is, Hanafis, and Ja'faris and Zaydis, leave alone other schools that did not survive to modernity, that existed and became extinct. One of my favorites is the school of Layth ibn Sa'd, the so-called Egyptian school of thought. These schools engaged the Sharia process, but ultimately ran out of adherents and supporters. By the way, they ran out of rich people endowing chairs for them. That's the way that legal education dies. When you don't have any more rich people you can convince to invest in you. I guess certain things never change, right? As any university administrator will tell you. Anyway, so within these schools, there was a persistent insistence on the immutability of the divine and the separateness of al-hikmah al-ilahiyya, or divine wisdom, from al-hikmah al-insaniyya, or human wisdom. Al-hikmah al-insaniyya is in historical contingencies and in the interpretive process. And the interpretive process was where Sharia can be found. It is in the dynamics of law, not the outproduct of law. It is in the process of contemplating the divine, theorizing about the divine, not in the results that you reach in the ultimate sense. Because whatever results you reach are anchored in what they call the ghalabat al-zann, or probabilities. So that at any time one believes that the law is X, Y, or Z, they are articulating nothing more than a probability, a ghalabat al-zann. It is more likely than not that this is the will of God, but ultimately they always connect to it the disclaimer, Wallahu a'lam, or God knows best. I.e., in principle, because God knows best, we human beings cannot claim to have imprisoned the divine will within the human agency. The divine will must always be freer, larger, immutable, and eternal. And most important of all, must be kept separate and apart from the human will. Now, how about the other way around? We cannot imprison the divine will within human agency. But can human agency be imprisoned by the divine will? Well, the answer to that depends. Did God intend to lock human beings within a particular epistemological moment in historical progression? So for instance, if the Quran says women inherit half of what men should inherit in some circumstances, or if the Quran says sever or cut the hands of a thief, or if the Quran says met out a certain amount of lashes to the fornicator, in all of these, did God especially prize the act of cutting hands of the thief rather than ending aggression against property? Did God intend that women inherit half of what men inherit forever and in every historical contingency, rather than the idea of women being financially empowered? Did God intend to celebrate corporal punishment, lashing, whipping, as an end in itself, rather than registering a moral point about the ugliness of sexual relations without wedlock and proper boundaries? This is a critical point for thinking about Sharia. Now, I come back to Islamophobia. The most sinister and lethal thing about Islamophobia is that regardless of what you say when engaging the tradition, regardless of who you investigate within the intellectual heritage of Islam, regardless of whether you refer to Khatib al-Baghdadi, or al-Tawhidi, or Ibn Aqil, or al-Amidi, or al-Ghazali, or Ibn Rushd, and regardless of the arguments that you construct and the act of attempting to solve the act of attempting to decide on your own path and in your relationship to the divine, there is no way, no possible way to rebut the presumptions of guilt set against you by Islamophobia. In other words, regardless of how you engage the tradition, what conclusions you draw from engaging the tradition, you are presumed suspect and in a compromised state that cannot be made whole by the presumptions of Islamophobia. Now, at this point, you might say, well, why does it matter? If you're Muslim and you care about this tradition, why don't you just go about your merry way, constructing your tradition the way you see fit? Well, because of the legacy of colonialism. In the Muslim world, if you want to have a powerful impact upon the intellectual tapestry of the Muslim world, the best way of doing so is to establish yourself in the West, not in the Muslim world. As an intellectual in the Muslim world, your thought and your writings reach a far greater audience than if you discoursed internally within the Muslim culture or Muslim nations. So for instance, one of the most influential modern thinkers on Islamic law is Wellesley College, who is now at Colonial. Wellesley College has had an enormous influence upon thinking about Islamic law in the Muslim world. It continues to be the case, whether in secular universities or even in theological seminaries, that what comes from the West is celebrated as serious intellectual fodder, as worthy of engaging rather than not. Part of this is that, rather, let me backtrack 1 second. What Islamophobia has done to discourses on Sharia for the Muslim intellectuals in the West, is that it had put them in a non-rebuttable position of suspicion and guilt. And they have become quite engaged with responding to the lethal dribble that comes from the likes of Herji Ali or Irshad Manji or Daniel Pipes or and so on and so forth. In other words, the ability to think through the mechanics of Sharia itself with a level of self-confidence and the necessary level of freedom has been greatly compromised. But it goes beyond that. I would submit to you that Islamophobia itself has become a thoroughly political project of massive power gains. Saudi Arabia would not be able to do what it's doing in Yemen in putting 5 million people at the threat of extinction. 5 million people that face dire fate, including starvation, without the mechanics of Islamophobia. The United Arab Emirates, which classified CARE, the American Civil Rights Organization, as a terrorist organization, would not be able to work with the type of freedom defeating the Arab Spring wherever it sprung, without the mechanics of Islamophobia. Myanmar would not be able to exterminate the Rohingyas without the discourses of Islamophobia. China would not be able to destroy centuries-old population of Uyghur Muslims without Islamophobia. The nascent movement that reconciled between Sharia and the idea of liberty, bread, and dignity, which we saw spring up in the Tunisian Revolution and the Egyptian Revolution, and then the Libyan Revolution and the Syrian Revolution, would not have been able to be dealt an effective death knell without Islamophobia. That is why the Egyptian government, after the military coup, regularly quoted Fox News, and citing Fox News, and even invited some Islamophobes to Egypt and dealt with them as honored guests. Islamophobia, in other words, is a continuation of a dynamic that has existed since colonialism. Muslims are consistently faulted for being unable to negotiate and reconstruct their tradition in order to meet the challenges of modernity, in order to embrace notions of liberty, democracy, and dignity. But at the same time, every time there is a serious, sustained intellectual movement attempting to do so, the West, with its racially structured organizations, becomes complicit in the political suppression and the destruction of these serious intellectual attempts. I mean, think about our history with Iran and what became of that. The way we dealt with Mossaddeq's revolution in Iran, or even the fact that, I'll even tell you, I can't go back to Egypt now because someone like me would be promptly arrested and imprisoned if I would ever visit Egypt. So, since I come to Wellesley, and since Wellesley seems to have a history of graduating influential women who tend up to be movers and shakers in the society, I implore you, interrogate your own notions about power. Understand that Sharia is not about the set of positivistic laws articulated by a marginal and fanatic groups here and there that are locked in some type of power conflict with this Western power or that Western power. Sharia is about an aspiration to avoid the rootlessness, the uprootedness, and the alienations of modernity. The types of alienation that the philosopher Charles Taylor talked about in the secular and modern age, while anchoring yourself in a tradition, in an intellectual tradition, attempting to reconcile between that tradition and the best that modernity has to offer. As the rallying cries of the Arab Spring summarized it, these cries were bread, freedom, and human dignity. Let me put it to you a different way. I have been studying Sharia for my entire life, 30 years. And if you ask me questions about Sharia, 90% of what you will ask me about, I'll tell you, I don't know. I haven't read enough. I haven't studied enough. The tradition is massive. As an American lawyer, if you ask me a question, I will charge you close to $600 an hour to give you an answer. Maybe over 600. And in American law, we are talking about a tradition that at most is a century old. I will do research in the federal level, the state level, and consult various jurisprudential opinions and complain about the complexity of the American legal system But at the end, as all good lawyers will say, it depends. That's mostly the response you will get. The Islamic tradition is 1,400 years. 1,400 years of numerous thousands upon thousands of texts. It ranges from the most puritanical and intolerant to someone like Ahmad al-Ghazali, who wrote the following in defining Sharia. No, Ahmad al-Ghazali says, dear reader, that the essence of Shara, the root word of Sharia, is the nourishments of love, the ability to receive and give love, the love of God from God. This is the key to the attainment of true Sharia. Now, Ahmad al-Ghazali lived in the 12th century. He was not some guy trying to impress the West by repeating verbiage that you would find attractive. In equating between the nourishments of love and Sharia, to our ear, and even to modern Muslims, that sounds strange, sounds odd and alien. But part of reconstructing a tradition is to take what is strange and alien, co-opt it, re-engage it, remanufacture it, so that it becomes the mainstream within a certain historical moment, as the demands of time would require. I'll give you another quote from Ahmad al-Ghazali, which I like. He says, this is in his discussion on Sharia, there is no doubt that every lover gives a different sign of the beloved. Every recognizer provides a different explanation, and every verifier makes a different allusion. The declaration of our Shara is, our expressions are many, and your loveliness is one. You are here means God. Each of us point to that single beauty, the beauty of the Maker, meaning God, when we engage the process of Shara. Again, this is a 12th century scholar. Now, here's what Islamophobia does though. If I engage someone like Ahmad al-Ghazali and teach someone like Ahmad al-Ghazali, this is Hamid al-Ghazali's brother, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. Hamid al-Ghazali was a very influential theologian in the 12th century. Ahmad al-Ghazali was his brother. Less famous, but a marvelous intellect. When you write a study on the basis of thinkers like that, you find the accusation of political Islam ready to condemn you, to pigeonhole you, to put you in a place, in a defensive place in which you cannot emerge. If you address the accusation of political Islam, you feel you betrayed your own honor and your own dignity by engaging in apologetics. Why should I justify to you my intentions? I am anchored in a tradition that I struggle with and wrestle with, trying to co-opt the best of that tradition while discarding or de-emphasizing or marginalizing what is ugly within that same tradition. But at the same time, if you do not engage in this defensive posture, in this apologetics, you find yourself very quickly a marginal figure that is irrelevant to the public discourses taking place around you. For Muslim intellectuals, since the age of colonialism, this has been a thoroughly disheartening situation. And to the extent that any of you will reach a decision-making position in your lives, you must right this fundamental historical wrong. Muslims cannot continue being a thoroughly colonized people through and through, because that reality will only produce another reality, the reality of extremism, militancy, ugliness, and an act of suicidal protest, not just against humanity, but against life itself. I'll close with this. Right now, think about where our military forces are engaged around the world. Take a second and think where we are dropping our bombs and shooting our bullets. It is exclusively around the Muslim world. We drop bombs in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, Somalia. We are engaged in some type of black ops, one form or another, protected by the Patriot Act and various other legislations. Every 10 minutes, we, the United States, drop bomb on a Muslim somewhere around the world. Every 10 minutes, we, the United States, drop a bomb on a Muslim somewhere around the world. It has become accepted doctrine that collateral damage is justified under the Geneva Convention, and that collateral damage is so justified that we no longer bother to keep count of how many civilian Muslims we kill around the world every day. Perhaps, and this is perhaps, Al Jazeera reports on it, but other than that, it barely even receives a mention. We brag about our support, our enthusiastic support to the most dictatorial and inhumane regimes around the world, and consider it some point of merit. In this environment, in this climate, can we actually engage a tradition as nuanced, as rich, and as complex, and as historically contextualized and contingent as the Sharia tradition? I am not sure. Thank you very much.
You want to just handle the questions?
Okay.
There's 2 microphones over there. So please, if you would like to ask a question, go to the microphone that closest
You're
to
all
you.
women. I can't get over that. That's amazing. Women power, you know. Go for it.
My name is Kate, and I have a question, obviously. How do you worked or studied with both Sharia law and American law? What similarities or differences do you find between them beyond the surface level, and what can American law learn from a greater tradition of Sharia law? Perhaps what can Sharia law learn from the modernity of American law? If that makes sense.
Okay, the similarity, I have that's the easier part. Both American law and Sharia law reason through examples. The first thing we do in American law is to teach a student the linguistic practice of American law. There is a certain terminology that becomes a terminology of specialty. that defines what we refer to as the legal mind. And the legal mind, basically, means that they've learned the semiotics of law, the sort of the fabricated linguistic practice that allows someone to speak in legalese. And we anchor ourselves in reasoning from one example to another. Sometimes it's called reasoning by analogy. The same is precisely the process of Islamic law. The Islamic law is a linguistic practice, and it's a linguistic practice that is anchored in reasoning from one example to another. In a sense, the precedent for the legal mind in both American law and Islamic law is critical. I'm not sure legal systems, I don't think, learn from each other. Legal systems plagiarize each other. In law, plagiarism is not defined as plagiarism. So if you clerk for a court, for instance, as a clerk, you write the entire opinion, and then the judge who you clerk for will put their name on it, and that's completely acceptable. If you work in a law firm, you write a memo, and the memo will be filed in court under the name of the partner or the managing attorney, and that's entirely acceptable. Legal systems have plagiarized each other throughout history without ever acknowledging indebtedness. But I don't know, both American law and Islamic legal tradition benefit greatly from the interrogation of ethics, because both legal systems can fall into the trap of legal technicalities becoming their own justification. And when ethical insight is focused on either of these legal traditions, it enriches the legal tradition and makes it interrogate its own assumptions and its own linguistic practices. Part of what I'm talking about is that as much as I pride myself on trying to be brave and on standing up to Islamophobes and trying not to care about condemnations and stuff like that, I find myself unconsciously, despite my best of intentions, cringing at the idea of suggesting what what American law can learn from Sharia. Because immediately I start thinking about the whole Islamophobic thing about that they want to impose Sharia law in the West. And so I say, okay, I'm not going to say anything about that. So I catch myself becoming a coward. But I will submit to you that that's the reaction of any Muslim that talks about Sharia. While I might have been more daring in the 80s, terror, intellectual terror, does have an impact, and I'm disappointed in myself that I feel that cringe of terror. But I think anyone that denies having it, I don't believe them. Either that, or they haven't yet tried being targeted by Islamophobes and how vicious they are. That partly answers your question, but not really.
No, it didn't. Shukran.
This is your chance to ask anything under the sun. You can ask anything.
Hi, I'm Grace.
Hello.
I have a question. I really enjoyed reading Reasoning with God, and in it you referenced the practice of rote memorization and sort of lack of critical thinking when it comes to the Quran. I think you used the analogy of donkeys carrying books, and I was just wondering if you see that this practice is any way related to Islamophobia, sort of enabling or encouraging Quranic scholars, students, even everyday Muslims to sort of shy away from discourse and critical thought, and sort of what you see in terms of those two things being connected.
You know, years earlier, Edward Said pointed to the impact of the Orientalism, and Orientalism was a polite form. I mean, if Edward Said would have witnessed Islamophobia, you would have thought Orientalism is like a kiss on the cheek in comparison. But Orientalism and its descendant, Islamophobia, which is just far more vicious and hateful, has a chilling effect, and it functions in the following way. Places like Azhar, from the end of colonialism, and I'm talking from the 1920s onwards, is preoccupied with apologetics, preoccupied with defending Islam against the charges made by Western scholars from the colonial age onwards. Now, there is a practical reason. There's a very nice book that was published about the birth of the Ikhwan movement in Egypt and the impact of British evangelism, Christian evangelist groups, upon the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think this, it's in English. I can't remember the name of the author now. It's a woman. See? She argues quite convincingly that the Ikhwan was a direct reaction to the evangelical efforts in Egypt. So wherever you go, since the colonial age and the birth of discourses on Islam wedded to the institutions of power, especially imperial power, the Muslims have, and Muslim institutions like Al-Azhar, have been obsessed with defending Islam against the charges brought by Western scholars. Today, places like Azhar or other seminaries is obsessed with defending Islam against the charges brought by Islamophobes. That's on the one hand. The other hand is that, I can tell you of the number of colleagues that I know who they don't want to engage in apologetics, but they don't want to be accused of being an Islamist. And because of that, will go out of their way to anchor their discourse in sometimes quite superficial critiques of the tradition just to prove the point that they're not Islamists. In either case, what has remained since colonialism is Islamic thought as largely as a reaction, not a secure intellectual momentum that stands on its own two feet. I mean, a country like Egypt right now, and you can't point to a single, not a single systematic thinker within the Islamic tradition. There are a lot of people who write apologetics and a lot of people who write thoroughly secular work that is celebrated by Western institutions, and the height of their careers is to get an invitation from Princeton or Harvard, to go spend a sabbatical in one of these schools, to give a lecture invited by University of Leiden. that's their bragging right. They act like they're cool and all that when they go home. But a country like Egypt of 100 million people becoming completely bankrupt of any scholars or intellectuals working within the tradition, that's a testament to the ongoing power of modern form of colonialism. And I don't think, I think I used to be, in my younger years, be very bashful about pointing the finger at colonialism in the classical form and colonialism in the modern form. I've realized that the finger has to be pointed. We just have to become honest about the way we talk. There's no other choice. I don't find another option.
Thank you.
Great question. You could ask me about classical music. With classical music, when we get stuck at a complete rut, we change the modulation. We change the key. We engage in the modulation and change the key. What we need in the field of Sharia is a change of key. We need a modulation. And the modulation cannot be engaged in unless you have creative juices. And if terror exists, if you're in a state of fear, there are no creative juices. Scared people don't produce creativity. They produce reactions. No classical music has been produced in a state of fear. Not beautiful classical music. Dissonant and ugly, jarring stuff has been produced in a state of anxiety and fear, but that's trash. Good.
Hi, Marhaban. I'm a first-year student. I just wanted to say that. I have two questions. One is very short. Are you accepting non-cash payments for your books in the back?
The books are not mine. I just wrote them.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
But here, I'll tell you something about people who write books like mine. We don't make a dime. I've had graduate students who were shocked when they learned that you are not going to make any money from your books. You don't make a dime. So, okay, next question.
So my next question are, what other kind of more mundane, everyday ways we can capture the spirit of your talk? Like, how can we convey this knowledge in more of the mundane, kind of everyday interactions we have with people? Because I'm not a scholar of Sharia law or anything, so.
Were you born in the U.S. or raised in the U.S.?
Yes, Chicago specifically.
I have a lot to say to people in your position. Your American Muslims learn, the most valuable thing is to learn what other minorities did to stand up to bigotry and racism in this country. American Muslims have to step up to wake up to the dynamics of claiming their rights, understanding that in the West, those who expect to be handed their rights never get it. The very structure of political structure and social structure, the very logic of the law that we work under is that you get the attention of power when you make demands upon power. As long as you are complacent, power is not going to hand you anything. You're not going to be given any of your rights. So what I tell American Muslims is, you don't have to be an expert in Sharia. I mean, Sharia is an ethical project that you can learn about in order to be a good Muslim within yourself. But what is far more important is to learn to demand your rights and demand equal citizenship and demand that you be afforded the dignity that is due to you, and to learn how to use all the avenues of power to say prejudice against me, even if it takes the shape of a learned discourse about religion, is not permissible, and I will not stand for it. That's the one thing that I really value about legal culture. Remember that, unless you go to court, you file in court, you take the effort, you take the initiative. Court never recognizes anyone that doesn't present himself or herself before a court. This is an analogy. I think the entire political system is like that. And I think American Muslims are still confused about race. They're not sure if they are white or not white. Well, in my view, even if you are a convert and a white Muslim, by being Muslim, you are not treated as white. You are a racialized minority, regardless of what your race is. And you must engage that process as a racialized minority and demand your rights, aligning yourself with other racialized and oppressed minorities. I still see American Muslims as attempting to perform whiteness, hoping to be given the privileges of white people. You will never be white. I don't care what your ethnicity is. Regardless of how much you perform whiteness and pretend to be white, the club of whiteness is closed to Muslims. And for the foreseeable future, it will be closed to Muslims. The sooner Muslims wake up to that reality, the better. Tough, huh? Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Asma. I lived in Saudi my whole life, and throughout these past 3 years, there's been a rapid change in the way that Saudi has been. But anyways, so with the change that's occurring right now, what do you think is going to be the stance from Sharia law as progressive change happens in Saudi?
I mean, I don't.
Do you think they can work hand in hand?
Saudi Arabia, things change or not change in the sense that, yeah, it's great that women can drive cars, but the essential problem from the time that Saudi Arabia was founded till today is that religiosity is defined by the state, and that the dynamics of power are very authoritarian. If the state continues to define religion, whether that definition is more conservative or more liberal, the paradigm itself doesn't change. And because religiosity is defined by the state, there are certain social ailments that are allowed to fester in Saudi culture that are very problematic. I mean, I'll tell you, I've been to Saudi Arabia many times. Now I can't go. Not even to Hajj or Umrah or whatever. I would be made to disappear, as my friends tell me from Saudi Arabia. But whatever. But one of the things that I was struck by in one of my visits to Saudi Arabia, I once went as a guest of the Saudi Monetary Fund. And on the one hand, prayer time comes, were all chased out of the stores and told to go to the masjid and so on. But on the other hand, I attended some functions by very influential Saudi families where the Russian ambassador, who was sitting at my table, told me that he looks forward to this one event by the Saudi Monetary Fund because the alcohol he drinks in that function is better than anything he has otherwise. The person that hosted me, I don't want to name him, had an alcohol crushing machine, a bottle machine, where after you consume the alcohol, you put the bottle in the machine, it crushes it into fine powder, so you can discard it and without being detected. And that type of duality, that type of hypocrisy that is born out of a despotic culture has not changed. It has even become more exasperated because at the same time that there have been liberalizing tendencies from up above, the prisons are packed in Saudi Arabia to an extent that we have never seen before. Human rights violations are occurring at a scale that is mind-boggling. At the same time that Saudi Arabia talks, or the Saudi government talks about modernity and so on, it is coupling the experience of modernity with greater levels of political oppression and intrusiveness by the state. That will defeat any intellectual project about Sharia that might arise in Saudi Arabia, because despotism suffocates any worthwhile intellectual project. Despotism and thought can't exist within the same space. And the sooner as Muslims, the sooner we learn this, that the single reform that we need is more democracy, more liberty. If we want to help Islam, the only way to do so is through more freedom. I think the better. Otherwise, we remain trapped in this endless cycle of despotism, hypocrisy, dualities. One final note about Saudi Arabia. Today, I know some people from the Saudi ruling family, and the thing that always strikes me about them is that they care far more about what influential families in America think of them than what any Saudi Arabian think of them. That always amazes me, that their constituency seems to be non-Muslims in the West, not people like you, not Saudis. Maybe I'm just a grumpy old man who's very pessimistic and I have no good news. But I guess the good news is we must demand liberty. We need freedom because even the history of Sharia, Sharia has thrived as a system of thought and as a system of ethical virtues. In relative periods of more freedom, and Sharia has become more oppressive and suffocating in relative periods of greater oppression.
Thank you.
I have one more question. There you go. And then there are books that you search as a book, and Professor said that you would be more than happy to sign.
I'll sign it, yeah. I don't like signing stuff, but I'll sign it for you guys. You know, you don't know how what the organizers did to get me here, and I don't know, your professors really care about you and love you because they're willing to move mountains to give you opportunities. So I'm just impressed. I'm impressed by your faculty and what they do. You're lucky. At UCLA, no one would go to that extent. we wouldn't give a hoot, you know. It's like, yes.
I really liked what
you said about Islamophobia being a political structure that's been put into place for centuries that we absolutely need to dismantle for there to be any kind of harmony. And I wanted to know what methods you think we can use, what non-violent methods more specifically we can use to take away Islamophobia, to deconstruct it.
I mean, to be a lot of the discourses of Islamophobia, it's remarkably identical. Let me start this thought. A lot of what is said about Sharia is nearly identical to what was being said about Jewish law and the rabbinic tradition in the worst periods of anti-Semitism in Europe. What blows my mind is that when you go back and you read a lot of the literature about Jews and their supposed fidelity to Jewish law and that they're that they cannot assimilate, that they're not a part of society because of this and that. I've actually I teach a course on Islamophobia and the law, and one of the things I like to do is to simply present text that was written on Jews and take out Jews and put Muslims and trick students. And they read it and they can't detect the difference. When you tell them actually this is a treatise from such and such date that was written about Jews. The point is that what it took for intellectuals to anchor a point that, by the way, is not historical at all, and that is a Judeo-Christian tradition, because Judeo-Christian in a sense, but not a Judeo-Christian at all in many different senses. If you say Judeo-Christian, then by necessity, by the logic of the methodology, it must be an Islamo-Judeo-Christian, because whatever influence the Jewish tradition had upon Christianity, if we concede that point, then by definition, Islam has had that and much more. And I think that intellectually, journalists, publicists, professors, politicians, they all have a very critical role to play, not in articulating a zero-tolerance policy towards Islamophobia, that demonizing of an entire people and simplifying the history of the world as some type of fundamental clash between them and us is not something that we are willing to define the world in the modern world. We are not willing to define our universe according to these essentialistic parameters. I think any non-Muslim has a huge role to play in that, especially as you go on in your career. Those who become journalists, those who become professors, those who become politicians, even a politician that refuses to accept money from Islamophobic organizations. That's in itself huge. Not too many politicians dare do it, by the way. Refusing to accept the idea that we can simply continue to inflict violence upon Muslims and it doesn't count because they're Muslims. Where else can we continue dropping bombs night and day, killing civilians? How many people, can anyone here tell me, how many people did we kill in Iraq? Does anyone know? It's mind-boggling. How many people do we kill in Afghanistan? We talk about American casualties and we often see on TV someone that served in the army, we're very proud of our heroes. But even that essential question of keeping track of what the hell we're doing in the world, no one gives a hoot. And to not ask the fundamental question, is this anchored in racism? Because right away I'll tell you the answer is yes. If you have the attitude towards a people, then it must be a racist paradigm. then it must be that you don't count these human beings as human beings. And that's why it's acceptable to continue killing them. And by the way, if an Islamophobe is in the audience, I tell you they're gonna smash me in an article the next day, you know. Go for it. You know, if you're here, be my guest. You know, this is every time I give a lecture anywhere. The next day an article appears, the Islamist, stealth Islamist is at it again. They're racists, and they must be called out as racists. And anyone that continues the ongoing policy of celebrating despotism in the Muslim world, perpetuating it, is also a racist. I'll tell you one other thing. I can't resist telling you about this. Those of you who have, I know I'm keeping you from the food, but just bear with me. Do you know when, I did a study, and actually I talked about some of this in Reasoning with God. I didn't present all the evidence, but I went and acquired the correspondence of the British Intelligence Office. You can get them for $4,000. They're published by Oxford Press. They're actually not printed, they're just photocopied. And so I read through these 4 volumes and wanted to see what, at the time of the rise of the Wahhabi movement, what at the time were British intelligence officers saying about Wahhabism. And one of the things that was markedly striking to me was that on the one hand, one officer within the foreign policy office or intelligence community in Britain would note the barbarity of what the Wahhabis did in Hijaz and the massacres committed and their shock at the blood that is being spilled by the Wahhabis. But on the other hand, they would say, yes, but this is okay because this is true Islam. That Bedouin barbarity that we're witnessing, well, that's what real Muslims are. At the same time, they would not accept the idea that the Ottomans represented the true Islam. Although the Turks have been the sole representatives of Islam as far as Europe is concerned for centuries, in that colonial moment, there would constantly, the internal discourses of the British office is that the Ottomans were not real Muslims, but the Wahhabis were, and the Ashraf were. And the cruelty that is displayed and the barbarity that is displayed by them is shocking, but that's how Muslims are. It's remarkable that same process, that same dynamic goes on today. We insist that we are shocked by the actions of people like ISIS and Qaeda, but at the same breath, we insist that these are the real Islam. This is the real true Muslims. Anyone that resists this remarkable paradox, I think is doing something about Islam.